brothers out there that are in these different camps. You know, you have camp leaders. You know, you have men over you that are set up. You have camp heads, you know, second in command, third in command. You have regional heads, you know, and whatever's going on in your camp, the, you know, higher ups, so to speak, in that camp should be the first to know. You know, so if you're in the New York camp, the higher ups would be the apostles and the bishop. They should be the first to know of any issue going on there. If you're in California, you know, the higher ups like the Elder Mawatazak, the Elder Barakallah, they should be the first to know what's going on. Same thing with Seattle, same thing with Chicago, same thing with Dallas, same thing with Atlanta. Anywhere, you know, where there are GMS camps, the heads of those camps should know what's going on with what's going on. A brother from another state shouldn't know about a situation going on in that camp before the leaders of that camp. All right? And the scriptures speak about making sure that everything is done decently and in order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here in 1 Corinthians 14:37, because there's seems to be somewhat of a lackadaisical, you know, spirit when it comes to order. You know, and we're not tyrants, so we don't shove the order down your throat. You know, but sometimes you do have to put your foot down, because Jake will run dry shot over you if you don't. You know, if you allow them to. You know, because that's how Israel is. That's how Jake is. They're hard-headed. You know, and if you don't have a hedge there, they'll cross over that hedge. You know? So 1 Corinthians 14:37 says, if any man think himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things that I write unto you are the commandments of the Lord Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. You know, and part of the commandments is what? You know, part of this is what? You have leaders. You know, the scriptures speak about not cursing or reviling the gods. So there is a leadership established, and the leadership is established for order. It's not established to lord over individuals, you know, although you do have that right in certain situations to make sure that things are running properly. You know, so I've said this before, that you brothers in Great Millstone should feel very lucky, you know, and I use that term loosely, you know, because we're not like these other camps, you know, where they got, you know, a iron sinew around your neck. You know, you brothers pretty much are able to come and go as you please, as long as you're doing the work. You know, but if things start getting out of hand, you know, we're gonna, you know, lock down through the spirit and power of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. You know, so make sure you keep order. Make sure that you're doing things properly. You know, don't just be doing whatever the hell you want to do. You know, and when you have apostles or bishops or elders speaking, you know, hold your peace and wait, wait for the elder or the apostle or the bishop or whoever it is to finish saying what they got to say, and then you speak. Then you say what you got to say. You know, you could raise your hand or whatever the case may be. You know, we got to do things orderly. It says, but if any man be ignorant, let him be ignorant. And we're at that point now where we're not here. You brothers that's been in this thing almost 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, we're at the point now where we're not trying to go backwards, bend over backwards and try to, you know, see how you're doing, see, you know. I mean, of course, you know, the scriptures say, know the state of thy flock. Be not ignorant to know the state of thy flock. But as far as, you know, trying to keep you on a path that you already know how to function on, we don't have time to keep going back and babysitting. You know, you brothers out here are grown as men. You know, so make sure you keep the order. Make sure that, you know, you stay within your lane. You know, because if not, then, you know, there's going to be suspensions. There's going to be individuals that are going to be getting kicked out. You know, and there's a, you know, insubordination is not going to be tolerated. It says, wherefore, brethren, covet to prophesy and forbid not to speak with tongues. This is the main point. Let all things be done decently and in order. So that's the point. Let all things be done decently and in order. You know, there's an order to everything. There's a decent way of doing things. NLT, it says, but be sure that everything is done properly and in order. So in NIV, but everything should be done in a fitting and orderly way. So let's go to that word decently and then order. The word there for decently is euskeimenos. In a seemly manner, decently. All right. So a seemly manner, a way that's right, an orderly way. Let's go to the word seemly. Seemly refers to behavior, appearance, or actions that are appropriate. Like you have the one where it says in forget exactly where that is. It speaks about, I think that's Romans the 1st chapter, when it speaks about unseemly, meaning that it's not appropriate. So let all things be done decently, appropriately, decent, fitting, and in good taste, often adhering to social standards of propriety. Because you same individuals, I'm not speaking about anybody in general, I'm not speaking about anybody particular, I'm just speaking in general. You individuals that have a problem with order, you'll be subjected to your Edomite boss or your female boss at the job. You're not going to give them a hard time. But when it comes to the men that are teaching you, that are on a higher level than these so-called bosses, you give them a hard time. Which shows you it's a demon. It's a whole demon. So it implies decorous, polite conduct suitable for a particular occasion, and is the opposite of unseemly. See? So let all things be done decently and in order. Here we go in Romans 13:13. Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envy. 1 Thessalonians 4:12, that you may walk honestly toward them that are without, and that you may have lack of nothing. Yeah, because, if somebody sees you're supposed to be a teacher, but they see your actions towards your teachers, they're going to be like, they're not going to respect you because, they're going to look at you like you don't respect your teachers, so why should they respect you? Respect means to look back on. Read back, spect is to look. And if somebody wants respect, you have to be able to look back at what they've done or their accomplishments that merit respect. If your conduct is, insubordination, then why should somebody subject themselves to, honoring you or respecting you when you're not showing the same respect? And like I said, I'm not speaking about anybody in particular. I'm just speaking in general. Let's see. The root word goes to honorable, comely, right? So let all things be done decently and in order. Let's look up the word order, because remember, Jethro, he pretty much gave Moses the blueprint on how to set up and establish leaders. That's the reason why leaders are established, to be able to hammer out judgments that that would relieve the burden on one man or two men or 5 men or 10 men or 20 men. So if you're in these different camps and there's something going on, the heads of your camp should be the first to know about it. Not a brother all the way across the states, all the way across the country. First, he knows, and then the leaders of that camp know later or know afterwards. All right? Let all things be done decently and in order. The word there is taxis. An arrangement, order. A fixed succession, observing a fixed time. Due or right order, orderly condition. The post, rank, or position which one holds in civic or other affairs, right? And there is a rank and file system. We don't always make it known, because that's not what it's about. But at the same time, when something is off, then we have to step in as leaders and speak on it, say something. put the proper order out there. Make examples of individuals so that they can, so you could take this thing serious. It says, since this position generally depends on one's talents, experience, resources, character, fashion, quality, style. So let all things be done decently in order. And I'm get one more verse 33. 33. For the Most High is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints. Right? Because when you don't keep the proper order, that brings about confusion. That brings about, it removes peace. Because other individuals are watching your behavior and they're like, well, if he's doing it, why can't I do it? We have to show proper examples. Men follow examples. Men don't just follow words. Although you have some simpletons out there, men follow examples. And the better examples you show, the more a man will be willing to follow you. Which means they're following Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. Like in the movie Gladiator. When Maximus, which he really didn't exist, but when Maximus told the king, they honor you, Caesar. He said, no, they honor you. Because they're following his examples, because he's a general. He's a top man, and he's not sitting in the background watching his men get slaughtered. He's out there in the fight with them. And that is the ultimate example of leadership. Leading the men to the battle. And in this case, I'm talking about spiritually, in the spiritual battle. Not like the hirelings, not like the guys that hide in the background, not like Esau that has high ranks so that they can sit in a comfortable air-conditioned room while you're out there in the desert or in some jungle, getting the hell beat out of you by the enemy. Which these devils have created many enemies just because of the greed of the international bankers. But that's a whole nother lesson. All right, so let's look up this word confusion. The word there is akastasia, instability, see? A state of disorder. So when you don't have order, you have disorder. So when there's no order, what happens is that brings forth confusion. That brings forth a disruption within the body. That brings forth a disturbance. See? So a commotion, so things have to be done decently in order. It brings about instability, as it says there. So make sure, once again, if there's something going on in your camp, the leaders of your camp should be the first to know about it. Not somebody across states or, on the other side of the country or on the other side of the world.